gentlemen, good afternoon. Very nice to see you all here. Thank you for making this a nearly full house. I'm delighted to see how many of you think that we might have something interesting to say. I hope that we can give you what you are looking for. As you may know, the way that we're doing this at this year's ASU+GSV is we're doing pretty relatively quick fire sessions. We're not doing introductions to who on earth we are, and we're not doing questions afterwards, although I'm sure many of us will be delighted to take your questions and thoughts more informally after the session. So I'm Nick Kind. The others will very briefly say who they are, though I think it's obvious. That's as much as you're going to get. Please look us up if you are interested in who we are. This afternoon is about, as you know, international students, about transnational education, students from one country studying in another. And it's obviously a really important area of education. It's important for the students, very clearly, but it's also important for the institutions serving those students, and clearly, often it is important for the countries in which those institutions are based. And we're going to kind of cover those different perspectives this afternoon. We've had quite a lot of turmoil over the last few years, as some of you may have noticed. We had a bit of a pandemic. We've had very dramatically shifting geopolitics, particularly for those of us who've come from over the other side of the Atlantic today, and technology really making all sorts of new solutions possible in higher education. We're going to cover some of those, and picking up on the theme of today's and this year's ASU+GSV, what is the brave new world that we face? And we're going to explore that with you. So I'm going to dive straight in. I'm actually going to start with you, Esther, if that's all right. Given the terrific scope and scale of your organization, you have, I know, got a real grasp on just some of where we are, particularly where we are in terms of the numbers and what's happening. That's where we're going to start, folks. We're going to start with where we are, and then we're going to talk about the future. So, Esther, just a little bit of a sense of what's going on.
Sure, great to be with everyone today. Esther Benjamin from World Education Services. I will go to the Holland IQ estimates of the international student market, which was about a $196 billion market pre-pandemic in 2019, and the estimate that it will become a $430 billion market by 2030. And as many of you know, in 2000 there were about 1.6 million international students. We got to about 5.3 million pre-pandemic. So over 2 decades there was really significant growth in the market. However, when you look at overall student enrollment in universities, it's still a small percentage. It's about 2% that make up the international student market. Destination countries have been shifting as well. Some of the top destination countries over time have included US, UK, Germany, France, Australia. And what's been interesting in the past decade or so is the entry of some new countries. Canada is on the rise, and China, with many highly ranked institutions, also joined the top 10 pre-pandemic, and Russia also in the top 10. Interestingly, the UK, Australia, and Canada pre-pandemic were the most dependent on international students, and 25% of those 3 countries' student makeup was international students. Source countries, traditionally China, India, South Korea, Vietnam, and so on. And a big change happened pre-pandemic, which is that India and China sort of took each other's places. India became one of the top source countries. We at WES have been following the evolution with 2 other markets in particular. Nigeria and the Philippines are increasingly important. So with the pandemic, we saw in the US, for example, a 15% decline in overall student enrollment in 2020, but in 2021, there was a rebound, and about 70% of new student enrollment rebounded. So we did see that. And we are now back to a point where international students are about 6.3 million, again, higher than pre-pandemic levels. And there are some countries that probably will never go back to the pre-pandemic level. That includes China with the lockout of students and the zero COVID policy. Russia will probably not go back to the same levels. And now we see a consolidation of kind of the big four. And the big four are UK, US, Canada, and Australia. And they account for about 80% of the revenues from the international student market. So that's where we are, kind of pre-pandemic to a recovery, and I know we'll talk about where we're headed.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you. That was an awesome statistical and overview introduction. Joe, I'm going to turn to you. You've got a fascinating perspective, both as a politician and as somebody who's operating in business. You're bringing both of those angles today. Would love to hear your story about and your explanation for why some of these things have happened. There's all of those ingredients I was talking about. There's geopolitics, there's pandemics, all of that going on. Just how do you tell the story of why those changes, do you think, have happened?
Well, good afternoon. Great to be here. I mean, it's been a very, very torrid period geopolitically. I mean, who would have expected that you'd see a country decide to shut out half of its population from higher ed? That happened in Afghanistan. Who would have expected you would see a European country see a very significant proportion of its higher education infrastructure completely destroyed? That's happened in Ukraine. We've seen increasing concern about dependencies in the international higher education model arising from geopolitics. So in the UK, one of the big four that Esther mentioned, increasing scrutiny of dependence on those two big sending countries in Asia, China for undergrad, India for postgrad. These are creating real vulnerabilities in the UK model and indeed in other countries' models. So obviously, there has been great growth over the course of the last 20 years in international higher education. It's been one of the great boom industries of globalization. But there is increasing volatility around that trend of growth that's going to cause great dangers for institutions that don't do proper risk management, risk assessment, risk management, and risk mitigation. And when I look around institutions in the UK, for example, it's not always clear to me that enough care is being taken in this critical role of risk assessment, risk mitigation. The dependencies in the postgrad space that have arisen on students from one big sending country, India, are extreme, and they're replacing dependencies which had previously existed in relation to China. So the model is not totally working in this respect. It's creating real dangers to institutional resilience, to the increasing geopolitical stresses which we can see all around us. And it's incumbent on policymakers and institutional leaders to take stock of the risks we're all running.
Thank you. And Alejandro, I know that you spend a lot of time with institutions and institutions all over the world, given the IFC's coverage. Love to hear, how have you been seeing, again, we're looking at where we are now. How have you been seeing institutions respond to this period of change and arguably turmoil?
No, thanks, Nick, and thank you everybody for being here. My sense is that institutions are realizing that every student today is an international student in one way or another. Students are expecting even if they don't move physically from one country to another to pursue higher education, but nevertheless, they will probably expect to have at least one, if not two, international study abroad experiences. So in some sense, every student, or a large part of the student body, maybe 50% in some of the US-based institutions, or even higher numbers, are going to be international students. The trend is also that international experiences, if I may broaden a little bit the term, could embrace not only the traditional academic focus, but more and more work-integrated learning opportunities. So the idea of doing an international co-op and spending time working internationally and learning internationally in a work-integrated program, maybe with a company or a non-governmental organization or a government body. That's becoming also something that many students are expecting to have. Institutions are responding to that and are starting to offer that. I would talk also a little bit from the perspective of institutions in emerging markets, in developing countries. That's the focus of my work. Countries like Africa or Latin America, Asia. In most cases, institutions have embraced internationalization. We see institutions that sign hundreds of agreements for international cooperation with other institutions around the world. I think the main challenge in many cases, and those agreements promote, outgoing mobility, incoming mobility, the possibility to do a study abroad, in some cases even joint degrees. I mean, even institutions in some of the lower income countries in the Africa region are embracing this, and international mobility across Africa has become a very big reality. There are some hubs emerging. Senegal is becoming a big hub for Francophone Africa. I mean, we're seeing how students from Francophone Africa are also going to Morocco, from sub-Saharan Africa, Francophone countries into Morocco. It's becoming another big trend that we're seeing. But in many cases, I mean, these multiple cooperation agreements really need to be prioritized and require a little bit of focus. It doesn't make sense to have 400 cooperation agreements if you are going to have a few of these where there's basically 1 or 2 students enrolled, if at all. So basically focusing on quality, focusing on really expanding those figures and making these agreements meaningful is becoming a reality. How student mobility is promoted in developing countries and who pays for this is a big theme, affordability. Even when institutions reach agreements, let's imagine a south to north agreement between an African institution and an institution in Europe or even in the US, institutions struggle to find agreements where basically the student keeps the local tuition and can pay the local tuition when they go abroad. That's a big issue for many students. And even when that happens, many students are not able to pay out of pocket to pursue these opportunities. They don't have the means or the resources. There's definitely need for philanthropy and for specific scholarships to be promoted and expanded to really give students, and in particular low-income students, the type of opportunities that they deserve. Again, I could go on, but these are some of the initial thoughts, ideas, Nick.
Thank you, and just building on what you said and turning a little bit now to the future, because I'm sure that's what everybody here is particularly interested in. Let's talk a bit about technology and where we are with technology and what you're seeing in institutions. I mean, perhaps again, in some of those institutions in the global south as well as in the global north. You know, for me, there was this moment in COVID, you know, for those of us who were talking to people outside our industry and they were going, oh my goodness, online learning, it's a thing, isn't it? You know, there was this sort of dawning that it might be a possible thing that people found. For those of us, you know, who've been doing it for many years, I think we're all going, yeah. But it normalized in some ways, you know, doing things online up to a point. And you're talking about, in very practical terms, about people physically moving. How do you see the evolution, and how do you see institutions responding to the possibility that students might not need to move, or they might need to move some of the time or not? Fascinated to hear what you have to say about that.
No, thanks, Nick, and it's an excellent question and a fascinating topic. I would say many of the institutions we work with charge about $100 in monthly tuition. I mean, that's extremely low level. You definitely need technology. You definitely need to embrace innovative ways to provide students with international experiences. I think there's one initial layer, which is the curriculum of the institution can become more and more international and can become more global. Maybe the student doesn't need to move physically, but the student can access case studies that are global, can access obviously more and more faculty that is global. Technology can leverage access to the best faculty around the world, faculty exchange programs with where students benefit from lessons being taught by students, by faculty in other institutions, and definitely more of a hybrid environment where the student would combine online with face-to-face instruction, maybe study 1 or 2 days per week from his or her hall of residence or home, and be able to connect to experiences that are global in nature, international in nature. I think it's a key theme, in particular in low-income settings where students really cannot afford to physically move and are paying extremely low tuition compared to what maybe a student would be paying in a US-based institution. So again, these are some thoughts, ideas. I'm sure Joe and Esther would have additional ideas.
Sorry, I was just enjoying that noise. Yeah, I agree with what Alejandro was saying. I think online can clearly help reduce some of the shocking inequalities around international education and make it accessible to a broader group of people than it presently is. I mean, it's currently reaching only the top sliver of socioeconomic groups, and enabling people to access world-class education from their own homes. I would say this is with my role at FutureLearn, is obviously incredibly beneficial to them. We are going to see increasing sort of credit mobility rather than student mobility as a result, with people taking credits from institutions all over the world and stacking them into qualifications. And that vision, which is an old one, is starting to become much more of a reality every day. And the pandemic and the online learning that was undertaken during the pandemic has clearly been a big accelerant of that.
Thanks, and by the way, none of us are going to rap. I apologize. We can try afterwards, but not right now. Esther, are you seeing the demand for this? I mean, the possibilities are endless and exciting. Do you see the demand? Do you think it's going to happen?
Yeah, I think we were surprised at how quickly institutions adapted during the pandemic, and you had people, unfortunately, awake in the middle of their night from across the world to participate in educational opportunities, and we saw a lot of online and hybrid learning during the pandemic, but unfortunately, much of that has not stuck, and we've seen a return to in-person learning. And we are seeing, however, increases in online learning for students who are unable to make it to some of the top 4 markets are sticking with online opportunities, and we see students navigating costs, and online is one way to navigate costs. So we do see many African students, Latin American students, and others navigating costs in that way. But unfortunately, the instructional design learnings, the teaching quality learnings from the online experience of the pandemic have unfortunately not lasted over time.
That's interesting. I mean, so I've often heard, particularly commentators here in the United States, say there's a bit of a crisis of value in higher education. That the cost benefit is not stacking up. Just interested in, whether or not you feel we're seeing that with international students as well as, those based domestically, and whether that's playing out in some of these dynamics, or, what is the value that students are seeing, in making this leap, however much it might cost them. It's not necessarily a conventional decision. Pass to you and then move on to Joe and Alejandro.
You're seeing the affordability crisis in domestic markets, and we see that with the international student markets as well. And it's the students who can afford it who are making up this 430 billion market, but the others unfortunately cannot. So what we are seeing is interesting models emerging. We see many institutions in the Global South partnering with other institutions where it's a 2+2 model, 2 years in the home country, the final 2 years in another market, and you earn 2 degrees. So that's a way to 2 degrees from your home institution, home country, as well as the other country. And we see these programs coming to us and asking for an opinion on what the value of the qualification might be. We're seeing more and more international students study at home for undergraduate and pursue international studies at the graduate level. We see many students not coming to the top 4 markets or another market outside of their home country for a degree program, but rather for a non-degree program, and use that as a way to perhaps pursue employment opportunities and even an immigration pathway. So we do see the challenges that students are facing and different ways in which they're navigating that.
Joan, I don't know if you'd add. I mean, it's also fascinating from a policy perspective. I mean, what do you see the decisions that governments are going to make in this much more complicated environment, and how's that going to affect the institutions and the students?
Well, most governments have competing policy objectives when it comes to managing international students. The growth departments of government tend to see them as a great asset for the country. They bring in revenue, they create vitality in the economy, they help innovate, and they help startups and all the rest of it. The more immigration-focused departments tend to see them as a problem and try to manage numbers down. So governments have competing policy objectives, and this sort of results often in a whipsaw in policy terms, periods of expansion followed by periods of contraction. In the UK, we've been undergoing a period of rapid expansion over the past 3 years, which followed a period of prolonged stagnation following the reimposition of the removal of our post-study work rights in 2012. My anticipation is that we're about to see something of that whipsaw return, with measures to constrict the rate of growth in international education in the UK. Because of the dependencies I've mentioned, because of the pressures it's creating in local communities where housing needs haven't been properly catered for, and because of concerns around the excessive concentration of recruitment of students from a couple of big sending countries. So those are factors which are going to lead to a pushback. I think I would agree with what Esther was saying. I think there is going to be much more of an effort by institutions who want to stay active in this space to go to students in their home countries when the students are unable, for various reasons, whether it's financial ones or visa restrictions, to come and study in the UK. So we're seeing an increasing number of institutions look, for example, to India, where the government there is opening up the market to institutions to set up branch campuses in areas such as Gift City in Gujarat, and more generally through the UGC's other liberalization measures. So I think we'll see more institutions start to offer UK qualifications in India and other countries around the world. And at the same time, the online providers will provide a mechanism for people to do foundation degrees online, first years or even second years of their study online, enabling students to go to the host country for the completion of what might be an undergrad degree or a master's degree. I think an interesting evolution in this market is also the provision of virtual internships that enable foreign students, international students, to access the labor market in the host country, as it were, without actually going there. And so companies which are offering virtual internship services with companies in the host of the institution are doing something really very interesting that's worth watching.
Thank you. Alejandro, you've got something to say here.
Yeah, I think there's two types of unbundling that are affecting internationalization. One is the unbundling of the experience, and I think Esther alluded to that. Can I spend 2 years in one country and 2 years in other and get a double degree? Can I do work integrated learning and a co-op in a foreign country, or a virtual internship like Joe was suggesting? So the experience is being unbundled, and it's becoming much more diverse for students, and even students are doing this in the first year when they come into the university, which didn't happen in the past, that traditional focus of US institutions into junior year abroad. That's no longer the case. Many students are going to a branch campus in a foreign country. In Europe, Italy, Spain are typical destinations in many cases for this more branch campus type of concept, where you would spend a few months, either summer programs. The summer is becoming a key opportunity for students to develop this type of experiences. So that whole unbundling of the 4-year or 3-year in the case of England, or 4 years in Scotland, or whatever is the length of the study program is becoming a trend. And then there's a broader trend that's affecting our sector, which is the unbundling of the higher education degree. I mean, it's the unbundling because many students in the young generations do not see the value of pursuing a 4 or 5-year degree. It's too long, it's too expensive. They want a quicker return on their investment. They want to, to compile and stack different type of credentials in innovative ways. And I think there's a room for internationalization when it comes to developing these new pathways. That it is a reality, and it's not only in the US. I mean, this is happening countries like Colombia, where we do a ton of work. I mean, it's already happening. The enrollment numbers in higher education have gone down for the first time. Gross enrollment rates have decreased, something unheard of in a developing country. And there's a whole demographic dividend that has come to an end, which is due to different reasons. But one of the reasons has to do with this unbundling of the higher education degree, and that opens opportunities for combining these new credentials and micro-credentials in innovative ways with international micro-credentials that might help put together something that can be equivalent or not. I think the debate is out there to maybe a more traditional higher education degree. And then one final thought that I would bring to this discussion has to do with that demographic change that many developing countries are experiencing, with the exception of Sub-Saharan Africa, where there's still a huge demographic dividend happening. The traditional demographic dividend of most middle and low and middle income countries is coming to an end. That means there's fewer students in the traditional 17 to 21-year-old range. And there's more and more working adults that are starting to become a key area of focus for large higher education groups, and the whole concept of lifelong learning, how to constantly upskill and reskill adults is becoming important, and how to give those adults international experiences, global curriculum, and maybe make up for some of the deficiencies they might have had in their previous educational experiences that might be missing that global element. So that's also a very important area of focus for institutions. And we're seeing a lot of institutions focused on working adults. I mean, in Brazil, there's a very significant higher education market with even a number of publicly listed companies exceeding hundreds of thousands of students, and their predominant focus is working adults. How do we give those working adults international experiences? How can we enhance their skills so that they can be competitive, not only locally, but also in what's a globalized job environment? So I think that's also a theme for reflection.
Just going to pick up on 2 points mentioned by my colleagues. On a recent visit to New Zealand, I was really struck by the fact that the New Zealand qualification authority is actually placing micro-credentials on its qualification framework, something that really hasn't been done before. And New Zealand, which often drives the way forward, is working on that. And South Africans, the South African Qualification Authority is also working on something similar, which I think is really interesting for the future to see how micro-credentials map somehow against a traditional qualification framework. And I also wanted to pick up on what you said, Joe, about India, and I've been spending a lot of time there, and I think the Indian government and higher education institutions are really focused on competing for international students, and there seems to be a goal emerging to perhaps get to about 1 million international students. I think with the drive to improve the rankings of Indian institutions, that will be beneficial, helpful as they pursue this goal. And the National Education Plan of 2020 is very clear that this is a goal. So I think over the coming decade, India as a destination country and an affordable destination country is going to be very interesting to follow, but there's so much work to be done to be able to compete for international students.
So I'm going to move on quickly, and we've got a little bit of time left. I'm going to ask you a sort of a big question. You know, for as long as I can remember, there has been talk of, when is the era of the mass market higher education institution mega brand? Are we going to get these global institutions which are, not necessarily those elite Cambridges and Harvards, but really big institutions servicing global markets? You have a vested interest in the answer to this question, Joe, so let's acknowledge that, but I'm interested in your take first.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are institutions that are on their way to becoming global mega brands. I mean, ASU is probably foremost among them in terms of its scale of its ambition. I mean, this figure may not be totally up to date, but I think a couple of years ago, President Michael Crow of ASU was talking about reaching 100 million students accessing ASU's higher education in one form or other. If that's not, global in ambition, I don't know what is. So ASU is clearly sort of an exceptional institution, but there are others who, have got pretty extraordinary reaches. And, the nature of these big digital platforms, FutureLearn being one, Coursera, edX being obvious others, do enable institutions to reach extraordinarily large numbers of learners around the world. FutureLearn has 55 million, unique users. That's a huge number. It's not ASU's scale, but it's nonetheless a huge number.
Yeah, and I can speak also for the experience of IFC. We're an investor in Coursera, obviously, and we have had a long journey with the company, and absolutely, I mean, a lot of it talks a little bit about maybe a third unbundling trend that I didn't mention before, which is the unbundling of the value chain. I mean, these partnership models where universities are partnering with specific providers of alternative credentials, etc., is a very important trend as well, because at the end of the day, they can be much more agile in helping internationalize traditional universities. By developing a MOOC, many universities have been able really to reach thousands and millions of students, including students in very remote areas in developing countries that are doing a FutureLearn or a Coursera course. So I think that's, it is definitely an important element as well. The more the higher educational value chain gets unbundled, the more partnerships emerge. That's an opportunity for internationalization, because many of those models will be international in nature. So I think that's, and it is a trend that we're seeing in the sector.
Esther.
I'm not sure I can add to that, but we also see institutions that we wouldn't have seen before where a number of our credential evaluations go. Institutions like Southern New Hampshire University, we would not have seen that institution on the radar a decade ago. So we definitely see certain brands emerging in ways that was not the case before.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left, and I'm going to move to I quite like to end these things sometimes on a note of hope rather than anything else. It's a pretty grim world out there. So I'm going to ask each of you for, in this complex, dynamic environment that we're seeing, what's a hope you have for the future about this very complex landscape? I'm going to go literally along. Start with Alejandro. Move to Joe and finish with Esther.
No, thanks, Nick. I think every student today is an international student, and that focus on access so that everybody can benefit from global experiences is, I think, the key theme. It needs to go into and the whole diversification that the higher education sector is experiencing can help. We're diversifying in terms of modalities of provision, face-to-face, hybrid, online, and there's opportunities to provide international experiences by incorporating technology. We're diversifying in terms of the profile of the student from traditional students into working adults, and we need to develop tailored strategies for each of these ones. We're diversifying formats from the traditional 4-year or 3-year degree or 5-year degree into micro-credentials. What is the opportunity for providing global opportunities when we do this to our students? And then there's a fourth level of diversification, which for us is very important, is the diversification into those areas where the coverage levels are still very low today. Rural areas where many students do not have access to educational opportunities, areas with high percentages of low-income students, and in some cases we can also diversify geographically. Many models are emerging with a cross-border angle, so they're international by nature. FutureLearn, Coursera are great examples of that. So the whole geographic diversification that higher education is starting to experience, it's not only about international agreements, it's about branch campuses, it's about models that really cut across different borders. It's about transnational M&A, and Esther has a ton of experience in her past life with Laureate doing this type of transactions. All of that opens opportunities for internationalization, for providing students with international opportunities. And I think the future is every student should benefit from this. Every student is an international student.
Joe.
Well, I've got two, I think. My first is that we, echoing Alejandro, crack financial barriers to access at scale. Scholarships and bursaries don't do it. They're not a structural solution. I'm hugely excited to see great ideas here at ASU+GSV for how we can do just that. Martin Basiri, founder of ApplyBoard, is one example of that. His company Passage, which he's just getting off the ground, has got some fantastic ideas about how we can scale up access to finance globally. So watch that space. My second hope really is just a general one, that the forces of light prevail over the forces of darkness, not just sort of in the geopolitics, but in policy making in all of our capitals. The forces that see international students as a problem, numbers to be managed down, versus those who see them as a huge net benefit to our economies and societies. This argument is ongoing in all of our countries, and may the right side win.
Thank you.
I think those of us who work in education, there's a natural tendency for us to focus on our own organizations, our own mandates, and our own 5-year plans and 10-year plans. For all of us working in education, I think we've got to look past even our organizational mandates to what we need to do in broader society. I am deeply concerned that 240 million children are out of school. And of that number, about 130 million girls are out of school. Afghanistan has no education for girls. These are alarming statistics, and they're a result of unstable societies, and they're going to make our world even more unstable. So I think I find hope in the collaboration, the opportunity for us to look beyond what we do in the day-in requirements of our own organizations and roles. We've got to look beyond that. I love that ASU talks about their mission focusing on who they include versus who they exclude. So it's all about access. It's all about affordability. And we all have a stake in this. And we've got to look beyond. We've got to partner. I'm also back from the Skoll World Forum with a lot of optimism, a lot of hope, being with social entrepreneurs and social innovators. And as education innovators, we've got to look beyond, and we've got to see education as the great stabilizing force. And it's incumbent upon us to partner, to innovate, to invest in creating education for more and more young people and children. And that is the only way to build more stable societies, more stable countries and regions, and we all have a stake in that. So it's the broader picture.
I could not have ended better, so I'm not going to. Thank you all very much indeed, and thank you for coming.